Alright, so, Oathbringer. Right off the bat, we should say that this is personally my favorite Stomlight Archive book, so I'm hardly going to be the most objective about it, but there are some things within this book that I don't like, so I figured I'd start with those. Continuing a trend, not a huge fan of some of the world building. So basically there's a revelation within this story here that really ties into the world building and to some degree the history of the world and everything, and I just really don't like it. To put it one way, it's very allegorical, and, there's that famous Tolkien quote about disliking allegory. It's like, okay, yes, I do understand that he was influenced by, certain things, and yes, that's necessarily going to bleed into his work, but this just seems a little bit too one-to-one for me. It also tends to run into that kind of trope of the noble savage, which I tend to kind of dislike. I'm trying to be as intentionally vague as I possibly can, but let's just say that it's very obvious about what history Brandon Sanderson is trying to make an allegory for here in this book with the big revelation that happens near the climax. And I don't like it, and I don't know how else to put it other than you're not going to uncook this pie. But leading a little bit more into that, this is going to sound a bit weird for a while, but stay with me for a minute. There's this YouTuber out there by the name of Laserpig. I know, stupid name. But he does a lot of military analyst sort of thing and talks about, like, the efficacy of tanks in particular in World War II, because that's what people who make videos about tanks like to talk about the most. He has this understanding that there is a scale, a difference between the hard factors and the soft factors that make a good tank. So the hard factors tend to be the armor rating, how big the gun is, how fast it is, everything that would fit well on like a trading card. But he says that the soft factors are the things that actually end up mattering more. So that is like the crew comfort. How easy is the tank to drive? Ammunition storage. How many can be made? That kind of thing. How survivable they are. That's a big one. These are the things that actually end up mattering a lot more. I bring this up because I feel like that metaphor of a hard factor and a soft factor is a really good way to think about a lot of things. And in particular, the secondary race within the secondary fantasy species in the Stomlight Archive here, on the surface, on the hard factors, they look really different from from anything you would commonly see in fantasy. I mean, they're like, they have like very rocky skin, a lot of percussion instruments, very like, their entire culture is surrounded like gemstones and these weird sort of spiritual spren things, and they sing and they talk with a rhythm, and that sounds like it's a very out there sort of fantasy race in these hard factors. When you peel back the layer on these guys a little bit, in the soft factors, they are a representation of humanity before original sin, who existed within something allegorical to the Garden of Eden, and are more in tune to nature, partially due to the connection they have through the music of this world, through the rhythms of this world, or the music of this world. Yeah, these guys are elves, and I mean that in the sense that they are, in the soft factor, elves. Elves in the hard factor tend to be, humanoids with long lives, pointy ears. They tend to be a bit arrogant in most situations. But that's just what they appear like on the surface. When you actually read into things like The Lord of the Rings, or any series that actually gets elves right, the things that tend to come up more are those elements of being a representation of humans before original sin, being that kind of sing-songy race, being a kind of sing-songy race, being more connected with the nature of the world, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that that makes this like a bad representation of elves. As far as I've seen, that's actually kind of the third place, because most fantasy series I see actually tend to take the just do the hard factors and just go, it doesn't really matter if they're sing-songy or a good representation of humans before original sin or anything like that. It doesn't really matter, right? But this actually does that, so it's pretty good. It's just one of those things that I noticed in this book. The secondary fantasy race within this, the Parshendi, they're just really elves in the ways that actually end up mattering. Relatively straight. If you watched my reviews of the Spellmonger books or read the Spellmonger books, those have a kind of elf in them that I feel plays with the tropes a lot more. The elves are a representation of humans before the entrance of original sin, but in the Spellmonger books, original sin, it was actually kind of a good thing. This is, again, just played straight, which there's nothing wrong with, but it does kind of take away from the mystery of the world. And that is the ultimate problem I tend to find with Oathbringer. It's commonly said that science is like an island in the middle of a vast ocean, and the more you know about it, the more we realize we don't know about it. Yeah, I always think that Brandon Sanderson, because of how he tends to write, always tends to butt up against other islands, so it kind of reduces that mystery. The more I learn about the worlds that Brandon Sanderson creates, the less interested I tend to be in them. That is not to say that they are bad. It just means that I tend to find, and this is the book that really made me think of that, the more I know, the less I actually want to know. It's a really bad problem that I also had when I used to play World of Warcraft, which I stopped playing for obvious reasons, is that I really just would prefer if you didn't tell me some of these things. I would say that like a fantasy series that's like really good on that kind of world building can continue to make things interesting the more you know. Like whenever like one question is reviewed, you get like 3 more, and I just kind of don't feel like that's the case here. It's just like, the more I read the Stomlight Archive, the more I feel I got a general idea of what this world is like. And it becomes a little bit more tame. Whereas I can go back and play a game like Morrowind, and it still feels just so alien. Alright, now, after several minutes of complaining, why is this actually my favorite Stomlight Archive book? Well, this is very much Dalinar's book. And Dalinar is my favorite Stomlight Archive character. And I think one of the reasons that I like him so much is just simply down to the fact that you're not supposed to like him all that much. One thing you'll always note whenever people are reviewing or dealing with complex issues of morality is that who you're supposed to feel sympathy for is very, very fashionable. So, a lot of modern storytelling that's very fashionable wants you to feel very sympathetic towards criminal-like characters who are breaking the law because they gotta, and, this domestic terrorist is so totally justified because yada yada yada, and I guess screw the people who live next door to them who have to deal with the fallout. But, rioting is okay because reasons. You're supposed to feel sympathy for people who are downtrodden and all of that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has kind of led to the situation in which you're not supposed to feel sympathy for somebody who, say, owned a slave, regardless of the context. Like, it doesn't matter what else that person did with their life, what their opinions became later in life, if they actually had to grow beyond the thinking that was an okay thing. But people that own slaves, and regardless of the context, people who were conquerors, people who you could quantify as warmongers, colonialists, all of that, they're just people you're not supposed to feel any sympathy for. And that is everything Dalinar is. And somehow, Brandon Sanderson makes him out to be probably the most moral and inspiring character of this series. So, the thing I like the most about Dalinar is he is the type of character you're not supposed to like, but you do anyway. And there is something about overcoming that hump of, this is not fashionable to say that this genocidal warmonger is a really good guy in the end, or becomes a really good guy, I suppose you should say. But Brandon Sanderson somehow manages to do that. Partially through his ability to create just really great moments, but also just through, like, some really great character growth and some, like, really nice, like, kind of mantras that I think a lot of people have taken from this series. Like, I see a lot of people who have read this series requote the First Knight's Radiant thing, life before death, strength before weakness, all of that. And, you know, that's a good mantra to get yourself motivated to, you know, do some things. And then you have, like, the additional ones that come up with this book. Sometimes a hypocrite is nothing more than a man in the process of changing. In a lot of ways, it feels kind of like a actually well thought out self-help book written by the character of Dalinar. Yes, I was a very bad person. I fully admit that everything I did was completely in the wrong here. But you know what? I gotta keep moving forward. Which brings me to the next thing I really like about Dalinar as a character, particularly within the climax of this book. There is a really great moment that I feel, how do I put this? There's a kind of character that I don't really like, that I guess you could call them environmental determinists. They're characters that exist mostly as a response who you're supposed to feel sympathy for because, well, look what happened to them. And in this environment, this bad thing happened, and they never really could have, and they really just didn't have a choice but to become this, you know, genocidal warmonger monster. But within the climax of this book, there is kind of a direct rejection of that idea. Dalinar becomes a better person specifically because he understands, even if there are extenuating circumstances, I'm the one responsible for my actions. And it is one of those things that sounds like a burden, but is paradoxically quite liberating. This book is a very good rejection of just that kind of, I never had a choice kind of characters. And the characters that can learn and grow the best are very much the ones who go, no, I always had a choice. It was only ever just a rock. The last thing I'll say about this book is that I know some people had problems with the politicking of it all within it. Some people found the middle parts kind of boring because there was a lot of politicking. I don't really think that was much of an issue. My definition of what makes good politics and bad politics within a story is kind of met here, in that they're realistic within the world. I tend to have an issue with politics with, I think I did a video on last season of Brooklyn Nine-Nine about this, where the politics is very grandstandy rather than very understanding. And this very much is very understanding kind of politics. So yeah, last thing said about this book is that I continue to dislike the world building in this series, but kind of not enough for me to stop. But the character arc in the main character arc in it is something that I love because it is so atypical for what you normally see, and because it's so an anathema to what you're supposed to think is of the characters who you're supposed to feel sympathy for, as well as a complete rejection of the environmental deterministic character. Overall, if you've read the other ones, I imagine you're just sort of searching for my thoughts on this one. This book came out enough years ago that if you're really interested in the Stomlight Archive, you've probably already read it. But yeah, I would recommend it if you haven't seen this series and this is just somehow the first book or random video you're clicking on about this series.
And which one of us was a child enslaved on a world of monsters with his brain cut up by carving knives?
Oh, boo-hoo. Oh, I don't care if it's mean. Everybody's got dead people. It's no excuse to get everybody else dead along the way.